Singularity.
Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of Singularity One-on-One. Singularity One-on-One is a regular podcast feature of Singularity weblog where you can go and listen to it or download it in full. As you may already know, my name is Nicola, aka Socrates, and as always, I will be the man with the questions. Today, my guest on the show is David Chalmers. David Chalmers is one of the foremost philosophers of mind and a thought leader on consciousness. And I have to admit that I have been following his work at least since I became undergraduate in philosophy at the University of Toronto. And I started reading articles where he was describing thought experiments such as the neuroscientist Mary and others. So I'm very happy to have David on the show today. Thank you for being here, David.
Oh, well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. I've always wanted to meet Socrates, so this is now my chance.
That's a unique opportunity indeed. Okay, so David, I'd like to address some of the global biggest problems that humanity is facing today, since you are a philosopher, and that's a rare opportunity to be a guest on the show. But before we get there, I'd like to begin with your motivation and your background. So let's start with a question of how and why did you get interested in philosophy?
Oh, boy. Well, I started out with an interest in mathematics and science. As a kid, I was always a math geek, reading up everything I could and doing maths competitions and so on, and went to university, actually did my first degree in pure mathematics. At the same time, I always had some kind of philosophical interest in the background. I did one course in philosophy as an undergraduate. Didn't do very well. It was the worst course on my academic record, but I guess it got me interested. And more and more, actually, I got obsessed by questions about consciousness. It just struck me these were the most interesting unsolved questions for science today. 500 years ago, you'd be thinking about space and time, or 100 years ago, you'd be thinking about evolution, and earlier this century about quantum mechanics. But right now, the bit of the world we just don't understand is the mind and consciousness. And so I guess that, rather than thinking about that in terms of philosophy, the problem of consciousness just drew me in, and it seemed to me that to think about consciousness the way I wanted to think about it in terms of a big picture, philosophy was the way there. So I took a long, complicated path. I went to Oxford to study maths. I thought about doing philosophy. I went to Indiana, where I worked with Doug Hofstadter in an artificial intelligence lab, and gradually found my way into philosophy that way.
That's a fascinating path to philosophy. So perhaps I should restate my introduction and ask you and pose it as a question. Do you consider then yourself to be first and foremost a philosopher or a scientist?
Oh, I would say by now I'm pretty thoroughly a philosopher. I've been doing it for a couple of decades now, but I didn't, come into this necessarily to be a philosopher or a scientist. And I think these lines are sometimes fairly artificial. I think about this stuff with many of the same motivations I had when I was a kid studying maths, or when I was working in a AI lab. Now, there are some obvious differences. I don't do experiments. As a graduate student, I used to write some code. I don't even write serious code anymore. I do thought experiments, I think, and I reason. And in that sense, I'm philosophy. I'm surrounded by philosophers a lot of the time in my day job, so to speak. So I suppose I've by now internalized some of the values of a philosopher. But still, what's fundamentally driving me, as I think with a lot of people in philosophy and in science, is not being a philosopher, being a scientist, but just these fundamental questions like, what is consciousness? What is the nature of reality? Could there be artificial intelligence, and so on? Same questions for all of us.
Yeah, and you're one of the actually very few philosophers who have tried to address philosophically the issues such as do we live in a simulation, as exemplified by the Matrix, and address even issues such as the technological singularity, which kind of leads me to the question, is it my perception, or is it indeed the case that academia and philosophers in particular kind of avoid or fail to engage that kind of material?
Yeah, I'd say there is some conservatism. That's fair to say. And some people think, all this has the ring of science fiction or something, so it can't be serious. Now, speaking for myself, I like science fiction, and I think some of the most interesting philosophical issues can be raised by it. And I think these questions are very serious. Questions about the singularity, about simulations, are very serious, very important questions. So I suppose I've tried to drag some philosophers around, along with a few other philosophers have done this, Nick Bostrom and Dennett maybe, and some others. But I think the way to try to drag them in, my strategy has been to show not only are these important questions practically to think about, but they're philosophically really interesting questions. Thinking about whether you're living in a simulation, living in a matrix, you can bring to bear some of the tools of philosophy on that. Epistemology, metaphysics, and so on, and it will shed light on some important traditional philosophical questions. Go back to Descartes and so on. Likewise, for thinking about a singularity, I think there are interesting philosophical questions there. So I'm hopeful that in the years to come, there's going to be a gradual trend of philosophers becoming interested in these subjects, because philosophers do like to interface with other areas. It's just a matter of making the case that this other area is a productive one to interface with.
Now that Socrates has gotten involved in it, I mean, it should start picking up.
Yeah, I think that's going to be great for the branding.
But the other issue is, do philosophers fail to engage technology in general? So putting aside just the singularity and the simulation arguments, what about technology in general? Is it the case? It seems to me that in some ways philosophy is kind of stuck somewhat in an academic mud, or I don't know how to pose it, but it fails to engage the exponential growth of technology in our daily life, especially for the last decade or so, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right that philosophy has done less with technology than it could have. I mean, people who don't know much about philosophy may think of it as this very conservative field that's stuck in the armchair and doesn't engage with anything much. I think that's actually wrong. I mean, there are a lot of philosophy these days is very much driven by interfacing with things like serious physics, serious neuroscience. There's been quite a lot of engagement even with AI, with artificial intelligence. But I think you're right that technology, to interface seriously with a subject on the topic of philosophy, you've got to find, in the mode of philosophy, you've got to find some way to make philosophy of it, to make it something you can chew on, argue about, put forward philosophical theses about, consider, and so on. And people have found ways to do that, say, with the foundations of quantum mechanics, which have been incredibly productive, certain basic issues in AI. You'd think there'd be an interesting philosophy of the internet, for example, but I mean, I think a fair number of philosophers have talked about the internet, but I think Bert Dreyfus wrote a book about it, but it hasn't become mainstream in the sense that it's a topic that every philosopher feels is on the front burner, and that's because I think people haven't found a way to really make. I mean, you need an issue. What is the central issue? And you need ways to argue about it to do philosophy. So for AI, there are some basic issues. Could there be artificial intelligence? For the Matrix, even maybe are we living in a simulation? That one's gradually catching on. For technology more broadly, well, what's the issue? How will technology transform our lives? Well, that's a bit broad.
Yeah, well, I think the issues are usually ethical issues or issues such as transhumanism, and all of those issues are issues that I will bring up in our consequent conversation. So let me just zoom out rather to the very global level and ask you this: what are the biggest problems that you as a philosopher think that humanity is facing in this century?
Oh boy, I don't know what you mean by me as a philosopher. I mean,
or as
the biggest problems are the biggest problems, whether I'm a philosopher or not. And I don't really claim any special expertise on this, so I don't think that my philosophical background gives me a huge amount of extra expertise than a regular thinking person is going to have. I think there are some pretty obvious ones, environmental problems and climate change, poverty, threats of all kinds of more and more serious forms of warfare and destruction.
Yeah, the reason I ask you that question is because I want to counterpose those to the issues such as the technological singularity and transhumanism, for example, and see if we can sort of situate them somewhere on the scale of importance.
Yeah, so I suppose, the one I've thought the most about is the singularity and the possibility of an intelligence explosion and the effects of artificial intelligence. How we measure importance, there's a couple of different scales for how we measure them. One is how pressing and how immediate the threat is. And second is how big the threat or the consequences are once it happens. Now, when it comes to thinking about the singularity, I think maybe it's a bit less immediately pressing than, worries about, say, nuclear weapons or, worries about poverty, which absolutely surround us and are in our face right now. So in a sense, I'm prepared to concede it's less important than those. On the other hand, in terms of its eventual consequences, it's probably at least as large as any of them. I suppose nuclear warfare that destroyed humanity, that would be a pretty large consequence. But a singularity which, basically has the potential to totally transform the world for the better, massively for the better, for the worse, that's as big a consequence as, probably bigger consequences, say, than climate change. So,
Yeah, for example, the Singularity Institute's main impetus for existence is their idea that superhuman intelligence will be a fact of life at some point during this century, and by default, it is unlikely to be friendly towards humanity. It doesn't mean it would be unfriendly. It may just be, impartial, so to speak, to whether we exist and survive or we don't. And that for them is an extinction category worth of a threat to our species. And therefore, we should create what they call a friendly artificial intelligence, which would sort of provide or ensure our survival. And in that sense, it's a really global cataclysmic sort of extinction category worth of a threat.
Yeah, and I think this is very much worth thinking about. I'm quite sympathetic to the Singularity Institute's goals here. I don't know if I think it's going to happen this century. Maybe it will. There's a decent chance of that. But even if there's a small chance of that, then it's something we need to be thinking about seriously. Good chance that there's going to be superhuman intelligence at some point, and we need to think very carefully about its design. I don't know if it's going to be this century, but even if it's 10% chance it's going to happen this century, it's something we need to think about. And it seems correct to me that the designs of the first human level, and especially greater than human level artificial intelligences, if there are any, are likely to have a very great effect on all later AI. So it's something we need to get right the first time.
Absolutely, yes. And let me just grab your 10% estimate there and see if I can put you on the spot. Do you really think it's just about 10% for the singularity to happen this century? Because I think in your paper you were saying that it's greater than 1/2.
Yeah. No, I said even if it's only 10%, then we would still want to think about it very carefully and very seriously. So that's something directed at people who are maybe more skeptical than me. There are a lot of people out there who say, oh, come on, this is pie in the sky. How do we know that singularity is going to happen? To which the right response is, we don't need to know that it's going to happen. Even if it's a 1% chance it's going to happen, the consequences are so serious, we need to think about it seriously. If you ask me, I think, what I said in my article on this is that my own personal subjective probability is something greater than 1/2 that there'll be human level artificial intelligence
Yeah,
this century.
and I tend to agree with you entirely on the fact that, really the timeline is irrelevant. From a philosophical point of view, we're just quibbling over a decade, or even if it's a century, it doesn't matter. The philosophical questions remain the same. And that is, are we going to survive, number one,
Yep.
such an event?
Yep.
In your
Are you,
opinion?
are you asking me, are we going to survive?
Yeah,
Probably
because Ray
not.
Kurzweil is often criticized for being way too optimistic on his take and our chances of surviving such an event.
Probably not in our current form. A singularity is likely to transform us very greatly. The question is whether that transformation takes the character of an elimination or something like a modification or an evolution. And I think those are probably the biggest choices that await us. I mean, if there is a world, say, 500 years in the future dominated by super intelligent beings running on hardware that's, 1,000 times or 1,000,000 times faster than our biological hardware, then it is a little bit hard to see what room there is in that room for just regular old dumb beings like us running on the dumb hardware, except maybe in some little part of the world they've cordoned off to keep us in a museum. And that's not terribly attractive. But then, of course, the technology is not just a matter of the other. It's not a matter of superhuman artificial intelligence and humans left behind. We can be modified by this process too. We can be enhanced, perhaps uploaded, perhaps sped up, perhaps modified in all kinds of ways. And that would count. You might count that as a version where there are still humans, but humans in an enhanced and modified form. So I think the real questions for me are, comparing that kind of future to a future where, there are basically no successors of humans at all, and they've been, the world has just been taken over by a quite, distinct and perhaps alien form of artificial intelligence.
Yeah, my take on it is that for as long as there's some kind of continuity between us as we are now and the beings that are going to be then, as long as there's some kind of continuity, then we can claim that we have survived in one way or another, even if we are mind uploads or sort of super enhanced man-machine cyborgs or something like that. But I'm always fascinated, and I want to dig a little deeper here, because I'm always fascinated by the replies that people give me. For example, Michael Anisimov from the Singularity Institute gave me 20% chances of survival in his estimate. I interviewed George Tversky. He gave me 2%, and his reply was, well, civilization-wide extinct is one of the perhaps most likely explanations of why we are observing an uncolonized universe, especially at the pre-singularity stage. That perhaps is the most vulnerable stage of the development of a civilization. So in his opinion, chance is 2%.
Yeah. So, in a way, there's two questions here. I mean, the question, will humans survive? Well, that's vulnerable to the sorts of ambiguities I talked about a second ago. What counts as humans surviving?
Yeah.
Does distant successors count? On the other hand, the question, will any intelligent system survive, or will they all be destroyed? Now, that is not, that's not vulnerable to the same kinds of ambiguities. Maybe there's some questions about intelligence, but you might think, we're just all someone's going to come up with the right kind of nanobomb or something, which is just going to destroy everything. And that would be pretty clearly the worst future at all if you value intelligence and sentient life.
And so if you were to guess?
What are the chances of that one happening? I don't really have a competent estimate. Around here, there's part of me that believes that actually, as soon as humans get their hands on serious technology, we destroy ourselves more often than not. But but fortunately, we live in something like an Everett many worlds universe where there are many branches evolving, and so already we've perhaps destroyed ourselves with nuclear technology in 95% of the worlds. But hey, we happen to be I'm on one of by definition, we're on one of the branches that survive. So I don't know if that's an optimistic or a pessimistic way of of looking at it. In any given branch, we're probably going down, but there's a pretty good chance there's always going to be some branch out there where, through luck, we just keep on making it through. It's like the Large Hadron Collider. Some people think, oh, well, that was going to destroy us. But hey, we happen to be in the branch where the bird dropped the baguette into the Large Hadron Collider just when they were going to start it up, and so we're still here. And maybe there'll be branches where that kind of thing always continues to happen, so to speak.
So you don't want to venture a number guess, like a percentage?
Oh no! I mean, I think it's an if you take that many worlds cosmology, it's an ambiguous question.
Mm-hmm.
What's the chance of it happening in any given branch versus what's the chance of it happening overall? I do think that we seem to live in a very lucky universe somehow.
Yeah.
Whether it's the laws are right or because intelligence has managed to evolve in this time frame because we've survived all these accidents. And this increases my credence in things like many worlds cosmologies
Mm-hmm.
because they provide some explanation for this kind of luck. Well, the lucky worlds are the ones in which we'll exist, and maybe that also provides a certain kind of insofar as I believe we're in that kind of universe, then I think it's very likely that there'll be some branches in which intelligence survives.
Mm-hmm. Let me take you to the little bit less speculative part of our discussion here. On Monday, I'm interviewing David Ferrucci, who is the head of the IBM team that created Watson. So I want to ask you, how important is Watson in the grand scheme of things with respect to the singularity? Can we claim that it's one of the more notable benchmarks? Like, for example, in 1996, Garry Kasparov lost to Deep Blue. Now Ken Jennings lost to Watson, and so on. Then perhaps a computer would pass the Turing test. Maybe it would be Ramona or some other computer. And can we say that it's a very important benchmark on the way to the singularity?
My first reaction is that it's not all that important as a benchmark. It's an impressive piece of technology, but not using a whole lot in the way of really serious intelligence algorithms. I mean, basically, it's sort of a general knowledge lookup mechanism that uses some pretty sophisticated search mechanisms, but not so surprising that a computer would be able to do well at that sort of thing, just as it's not so surprising that computers could do well at chess. On the other hand, people do say, well, the moment we can get an AI system to do something, then we say, well, that wasn't intelligence anymore. So, I mean, it counts for something. And I saw, I think it was Ferrucci, as well as Ken Jennings' talk at the last Singularity Summit. And I gather from those talks, maybe there's a bit more to Watson than I was thinking, and it's got some really quite sophisticated design going on in there. Still, I'm inclined to think it's more in the way of insights, in the way of sort of database design and serious search mechanisms than things I would think of as really flexible, general artificial intelligence.
Because it brings to my mind another sort of famous linguist who is famously skeptical of artificial intelligence, Noam Chomsky, who said, I think after Kasparov's loss to Deep Blue, that he's as impressed by Kasparov losing to Deep Blue as he would be impressed by a bulldozer winning the Olympics in weightlifting. In other words, this is very logical, sort of very mathematical, highly constrained kind of an exercise, which really doesn't mean anything in the grand scheme of things. But then the next step, since he was a linguist, then the next natural step would be linguistics or language. And I think he just lost the argument at that level, at least in my mind, with Watson.
Really? Oh, but Watson is not doing serious usage of natural language. I mean, it's not doing anything like full natural language comprehension, let alone natural language production. So Watson is doing some cool statistical stuff with natural language, and it turns out some statistical lookup algorithms are good enough to do the kind of thing that Watson needs to do. But can Watson hold a conversation? No way, right?
Well, not yet, perhaps, but and I would agree with that on that with you. But is it just mere statistics we're talking about? Because He can answer questions, he can ask questions, he can perceive idioms and questions that he's never heard before. So I think it's going a bit beyond mere statistics.
I'm not saying it's just statistics, but I think it's just a long way short of the kind of thing which Chomsky was talking about, which was, really serious algorithms and mechanisms for full natural language comprehension and natural language production in the expression of thought and the consumption of thought and communication.
Okay, so let's accept your argument. Let's say Watson is not really that important as a benchmark. What, in your opinion, would qualify to be one?
Oh boy, that's a good question. I mean, as soon as you give a benchmark, then back actually. I mean, to be fair to Watson, no, sorry, to the Deep Blue people, my PhD advisor Doug Hofstadter said back in the 1970s that he thought you wouldn't have a really great chess-playing computer until it was good enough to do everything in AI. To be like, people talk about certain problems being AI complete. To do that, you have to be able to do everything. And he thought that playing chess was AI complete. Well, it turns out now he's retracted that, because it turns out playing chess is not AI complete. That's something you can do in a specialized way without being generally intelligent. Likewise, playing Jeopardy turns out not to be AI complete. So what is something that's closer to being AI complete? The Turing test is not a really serious Turing test is not a bad benchmark here. I mean, to really be able to maintain a convincing conversation on arbitrary topics in the long term that would certainly convince me. I mean, the Turing test is probably too high a bar, in that I don't think that machine intelligence would have to be human-like to be intelligence. There's no intelligent. It wouldn't have to be able to mirror every conversational property of humans. I mean, but that would be a sufficient condition.
But wouldn't it be too late for the singularity if we have the successful passing of a Turing test? I mean, I'm hoping we can find like smaller step benchmarks so that we can see the writing on the wall a little bit earlier, because the concern is, especially if we have a hard takeoff, what Werner Vinge calls a hard takeoff, and the singularity happens only hours or minutes after that moment, then we'll basically be hijacked by the unfolding events.
So what do you think makes a good benchmark?
Well, I don't know. I'm just looking to discover for myself. The Turing test is definitely one of the major ones, I would say. Now, it's again a test that has a number of problems and issues in its own right. But I think it's a great beginning, even though, there would be skeptics even after the machines pass the Turing test. There would be people who would say exactly the same thing that was said at Deep Blue and at Watson, which was, it really doesn't mean anything. It doesn't change anything in the grander scheme of things. It's just AI-specific kind of capability. It doesn't mean that it can understand what we're talking about if we're conversing with it.
Well, whether it understands or not, and this connects to issues I'm interested in about consciousness.
Exactly.
Whether it understands or not, I think that's a very important philosophical issue. But for practical purposes, it doesn't matter so much. What matters for whether we survive or die and so on, what matters for the future is what the machine does. And if it turns out it can do things like have incredibly convincing conversations, design amazing new weapon systems, do science, transform the planet without understanding and without being conscious, then that's not really very much consolation for the human race. So I think to some extent one can bypass some of those questions about is it truly understanding. But another benchmark is going to be design. Can you get AIs that can design new technology, design systems, design new computers, and so on? Maybe initially in a fairly small scale way, but once they can do it in a small scale way, then maybe large scale isn't too far away. And of course, once that's happening, then designing new AIs.
But people would say that's already been happening at a small scale. For example, when we were talking about the designing of certain chip architectures and stuff like that.
Yeah. That's an assistive role, I think, and certain algorithms for optimization and so on. I mean, it's hard to draw the line between what's brute force and what's creativity. But we all know that the best design of technology involves a lot of creativity on the part of the engineers, the scientists, the designers who come up with that. I mean, once machines are able to do that, then I start to worry. Then you start to think pretty soon maybe this could be put to bear on designing AI technology, and then self-improvement, recursive explosion, and so on becomes quite near on the horizon. Now, that making that into a benchmark, though, does require drawing the distinction between something like creative design and brute force design, and I'm not certain how best to turn that into a benchmark.
My personal feeling is that it seems to me that at least since the time of the spinning jenny, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, machines are getting better and better than humans at pretty much most things that we can think of, one step at a time, right? In the beginning, it was just at wool spinning. Eventually, now it is in terms of chess, Jeopardy, car driving. This summer, I rode in the Google autonomous car, and that car has had 2 accidents, and both of those occasions it was on manual. Or one of them was on manual when an engineer was moving it from one parking spot to another, and the second time a car from behind hit it on a red light. So, in other words, and it has had something like 220,000 miles. So they're arguing that it's actually supposedly safer than the average human driver.
I imagine they're very conservative about the situations they put it in compared to the situations that human drivers get put in.
I imagine that too, but still, it's a very early technology, and
It is impressive, yeah.
give it another 5 years or 10 years at worst, and it will be the same story as welding or spinning wool, and the same applies to planes. You know, planes are not being flown anymore by pilots. Pilots just take off and land. That's all they do, really. And so my thing is that if I observe that phenomenon happening over and over and over again for the last several hundred years, then our area of expertise, where we're totally irreplaceable, is constantly shrinking. And that, for me, is a clear trend.
So it seems right that it is constantly shrinking, and the question is it shrinking to zero, or is there some barrier there, or
Something
is
unique,
it shrinking
yeah.
to zero in the near term or in the long term?
Yeah.
Maybe in the long term it shrinks to zero, but I don't think you can extrapolate from this shrinkage that within 50 years machines are going to be able to do everything that humans can do. In particular, because it does look that there is this pretty strong barrier when it comes to intelligence. I mean, artificial intelligence has just been harder than we thought it would be at the beginning. I mean, people sometimes criticize these early Dartmouth pioneers in the 1950s for saying, hey, it's just around the corner. But, I think if I'd been there then in the 1950s, I'd just seen what computers could do. They were universal. They were algorithms. We could design whatever algorithm we want. I would have thought it was just around the corner. Yeah, give us 20, 30 years, and we'd have made amazing progress towards artificial intelligence. And really, now looking back in retrospect, that hasn't happened. Certain aspects of intelligence have just turned out to be incredibly hard to come up with algorithms for general intelligence, for flexibility, for creativity, and so on. Really the core of intelligence, to the point where some people say, a year spent working in AI is enough to make you believe in God. it's just so hard to get this whole intelligence thing going. It's harder than you would think, and I don't know what we should learn from that. But one thing I learned is maybe there are some. One thing we have learned is that AI is just harder than we thought. And an open question for me is whether that's for a principled reason. Maybe there's some really big barrier here that we just need to overcome. It might take a century, or is it just because it's a long hill we're climbing and we'll be up it in a few decades? I think the jury really is out.
Yeah, I recently interviewed Ramez Naam, and he was one of the creators of Microsoft Word and Outlook, but he was also behind the Bing search engine. And he said that, the artificial intelligence that he saw there being created for Bing was absolutely amazing. And yet, in his opinion, it was nothing like human intelligence. It's like there's no comparison even. So in his mind, we're very far away from any reasonable comparison. And yet again, there's other people who are equally expert in the field who claim the opposite. So it's really hard to gauge where we can go. But let me ask you here on consciousness and especially how it pertains to mind uploading. I also recently interviewed Dr. Randall Kuna, and he said that in his opinion, mind uploading is not science fiction anymore, and he's working on the whole brain emulation project. What do you have to say about that?
Well, he's more of an expert on the technology than I am, so I respect his opinion. On the other hand, there is this phenomenon for all these technologies that the people are the experts are the ones who are working on the topic, who A, have a certain investment in the technologies being successful, and B, perhaps there's a selection effect of the whole range of opinions about how soon these things are likely to happen. The ones in about the upper 1% of that range are the ones who end up going into the field. So the experts, there is the phenomenon of the experts having over-optimistic views, and I think that happens in AI. It also happens in uploading technology. So with all respect to Randy, I would, the fact that he has these optimistic views, I don't take as giving me all that strong evidence that it's just around the corner. On the other hand, here where at this point we're quibbling over, is it years, is it decades, is it centuries? If we're prepared to abstract a bit away from the time frame, I'm totally on his side that, at some point in the next century or so, probably, we'll get it to the point where we're able to simulate brain systems computationally pretty well, and therefore, in principle, upload a brain onto a computer by simulating that brain's processes on a computational system. And then, of course, the philosophical question arises. One, will it be conscious, the uploaded system? And two, if it came from my brain, will it be me? Or will it just be someone else? My twin, nice for them, but I'm gone.
And let me ask you then, in your opinion, in order to accomplish that, whenever it might be, do we need to resolve what you call the hard problem of consciousness?
In order to answer that question about will it be conscious, I think it would help, but maybe it's not necessary. So the hard problem of consciousness is basically how do physical processes give rise to consciousness in the sense of subjective experience, not all this things we can do and that we say and so on, but the experience from the inside. And my own view is that we don't right now have any terribly good answers to that, and there are good reasons to think that any purely physical or neurobiological solution to that is going to have holes. With that said, the question about whether computers can be conscious or whether uploads can be conscious, for a really fully satisfying solution to that, you'd want a full theory of how physical processes give you consciousness. We could see, does that apply to a machine? But even without a full theory, maybe there are indirect considerations that bear on this. So, for example, we can think about, one thing I like to do is think about what would go on during a gradual uploading process. If my neurons are replaced one at a time by functionally equivalent, silicon artificial neurons. Mm-hmm. And I think if you think through the possibilities here, if they're functionally equivalent, then what happens over the course of a whole transfer of my brain from biology to silicon? If you think uploads aren't conscious, you've got to think it either gradually disappears during the process or it suddenly disappears at some point during the process. And I think, just running through the thought experiment, those are fairly unlikely. And that gives us some good prima facie reasons to think that this process would preserve consciousness. If you're right about that, then at least some uploaded silicon systems can be conscious. And I got to that without presupposing a solution to the hard problem. So I think there are ways to think about it without a full theory of consciousness. But, certainly having a full theory of consciousness would be very helpful in thinking about this. I'm a bit more pessimistic about us having that full theory of consciousness in the next century than I am about the possibilities of uploading. So maybe we should we should use every way to think about these issues that we can. This is a place where philosophy is suddenly going to be incredibly practically important. Mm-hmm. People are going to have to make this decision. Do I upload? Or do I not? It's like I could just get rid of my old body and go into this. Well, my philosophical beliefs will make all the difference here. If I believe that the upload's going to be me, then absolutely, maybe I'll upload. If I think, on the other hand, that what's at the other end is not going to be conscious, it's merely going to be a zombie, or if I think it's going to be conscious, but it's going to be someone else, then I'm not going to do it. So I can see suddenly in 100 years, or whenever this becomes possible, people are going to be having this philosophical question may become one of the defining questions of our age, and we're going to be arguing over it, and suddenly philosophers are going to have a job to do. So that'll be interesting.
Yeah, it seems to me that this is precisely the crux where philosophy would suddenly become very useful, and practical for everyone. I mean, first of all, the issue is way too important to be left over to technologists and engineers and mathematicians and AI researchers. So philosophers definitely have to contribute, but at some point it will become every human's fundamental issue of existence, because I think it goes back to the ancient question of know thyself from ancient Greece, from the temple of Apollo in Delphi, and it goes to the question of what does it mean to be human, who we are, who you are, and I mean we haven't been able really honestly to come up to a consensus and find those questions for thousands of years. And I'm afraid we're going to have very narrow timeline to come up with a new version 2.0.
Yeah. I do think the following is likely to happen. After uploading technology actually becomes possible, it's going to make people more optimistic about surviving uploading, because the following is going to happen a lot. You will see your friends uploaded. They'll go into computer simulations, and assuming they're good enough simulations, we know how they're going to respond. They're going to say, oh, yeah, here I am. Yeah, I'm fine. I'm still conscious. It's still me. I remember you. I remember everything. We'll have a conversation and so on. And that will have the effect, I think, of practically convincing people that their friends are still there, that they've survived the process in a way that is going to make it relatively hard for them to hold out resistance. I mean, there's still the theoretical possibility. Oh, no, you're a zombie.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. Your problem...
You're a fake. But once you're actually there talking and interacting with them, it's going to become about as hard to do that as... I mean, I can do that to you now, too. I can say, hey, you're a zombie. But once I'm actually interacting with you, it's very difficult to maintain that line. I suppose, on the other hand, once you get multiple uploads, if we all create 5 copies of ourselves, then it's going to be very hard to maintain the line that they're all yourself. And that would transform our attitudes in a different way. Maybe we then become come to be very skeptical about whether uploads count as the original person. So maybe the way our philosophical attitudes evolve is partly contingent on the forms of uploading that become common in the future.
Yeah, and that's why I think we should, or at least I'm trying to bring in ethics into the whole issue, because I think ethics is our only. I mean, I'm an atheist, so for me at least, it's not religion that would provide the sort of a framework to evaluate this, but it would be ethics, and I think it would be the most practical way of adopting ethics in a situation like this. But let me ask you this. I know that you are also an atheist. What do you think on the topic of immortality, though? Because you can, as it turns out, we can still be atheists, and yet we might have to confront the idea of immortality, be it as uploads, be it as, genetically modified beings, or in some other way.
Yeah, I think these two topics should be totally separated. You could be a theist and believe we're mortal, and you can certainly be an atheist and think we'll live together, live forever. As far as I can tell, mortality as we currently understand it's a contingent consequence of certain properties of our biological systems, and people are working to combat that, whether it's the anti-aging crowd or even the uploading crowd. The reasons which apply to human systems, biological systems being mortal, may not apply to uploaded systems. I suppose there are still some very general reasons, like the second law of thermodynamics and the heat death of the universe, and so on, to worry about. But if those are the worst of our problems, then I think we're that's sort of near enough immortality, so to speak. So no, I think immortality is, I think immortality is a very serious prospect and one to take seriously. And my only worry is that it's not going to happen quite soon enough for me. I think maybe it's going to be one of the last generations that doesn't quite get to be immortal. So
on the other hand, we might as well be philosophical about it and say, well, if it doesn't happen for us, at least it would happen for the next generation or the one after it.
Yeah, on the other hand, which is nice for me as a moral being with concern for everyone else out there. But hey, I'm a selfish being too, and I want to. If there's going to be a singularity, I want to be around for it. So my best hope might be being reconstructed. Hey, I tell you what, you keep this video online in the Singularity weblog, and once the singularity happens, they're going to go to the Singularity weblog records, and say, what do people say about this? And hopefully they'll see you, and they'll see me, and they've got a lot of information. Hey guys, you can look at me from all these angles. You can listen to everything I'm saying, everything I'm doing. From all that information, a super intelligent being ought to be able to reconstruct a whole lot of the processes that generated that superficial information. Hopefully they'd be smart enough, they can get my brain, enough of my brain back from this that I'll be a reconstructed upload, and maybe that's my route to immortality.
That's exactly right. But I mean, and that's what kind of Ray Kurzweil is intending to do with his own father. He's like meticulously collected every single bill, letter, note that his father has written, and pictures and sound recordings and all of that. But then the question, of course, again, is, as you pointed before, that is that the same person? Would that be his father? And my reply would be definitely not. Personally, even if you go and take, say, DNA samples and recreate, a biological clone, it would still not be his father, because it didn't have the experience and all those sort of neural structures that his original father had.
What if we do it gradually? What if it's a good enough simulation that it really does simulate all of his internal neural structures?
Where do we get all the information for that, though?
Okay, you just said we have really good brain scans.
Perhaps, yeah, that's definitely an option. But for somebody who's already died in the past and we don't have those, then that's not an option.
I'm hoping that these AI, once you're super intelligent, reverse engineering is going to be an art. There's only going to be so many systems that we are going to produce all these outputs and things like this. And so I hope this is on high definition video, by the way.
Well, we have to blame your Wi-Fi connection for not.
Construct a lot of the internal processes.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I really hope you're right, but then again, they would say, well, this was a low definition recording of the video, so we can only recreate like 30% of David and Nick.
Maybe a bit enough though, if I find enough videos, enough you write some books. Okay, there's only so many bits in the book. We need some way to get what we really ought to be doing is just saving as much information about ourselves as we can. I suppose I ought to go in for a brain scan. I haven't done that yet, but not to mention the whole cryonics thing.
David, I love talking to you, but I'm afraid we're running out of time. And out of respect for your time, I'd like to close our interview with two very quick questions. And the second last one is this: where can people find more information about you and your work?
Oh, well, the best way to do that would just be to go to my website, which the easiest way to find it would be a Google search on my name, David Chalmers, or the address is consc.net, CONSC, as in consciousness.net, and then there's just a billion papers and articles and other things, jokes, links, photos, all kinds of fun stuff there. I've got a photo gallery of philosophers, photos of all the philosophers around the world you might want to see what they look like, and so on. So that's the best way.
Fantastic. And do you have a parting message, perhaps in a couple of sentences, the most important thing that you would like our viewers and listeners to take away from this interview with you today? And the AIs who are going to eventually recreate you.
Well, your viewers are very sophisticated, so I don't know, let's see, what would be a good parting message for them. But in general, I think one message I've been trying to get across about this stuff is that not only are these questions very, very practically important, they might have a huge effect on the future of humanity and the planet, but they are questions we can think about in a serious and rigorous philosophical way. I mean, I think sometimes these questions have a bad reputation in academic circles because people think, you can't think about them rigorously. So one thing I've tried to do in some of my work on these topics, and we haven't really talked so much about that, is to say, no, you can apply the same standards of rigor and argumentation to thinking about the future and what's going to happen as we do to thinking about abstract philosophical topics like the nature of reality or the difference between good and evil, or even to doing science and so on. So I've tried to do a small amount of that in my work, but I'm sure that your listeners out there's some very, very smart people out there who've got the ability to think very seriously and rigorously about these topics. So I'd love to see, some of them, bringing that capacity to bear and just getting more and more serious, hard-nosed, rigorous work on issues about artificial intelligence, the singularity, and the future.
And I would personally recommend to my viewers to perhaps begin by visiting your website and reading some of the materials that you have already produced on both the matrix, the simulation argument, the technological singularity, because I think they're a great starting point at the very least. So, David Chalmers, thank you very much for taking time to be with us today.
Thanks very much. It's been a real pleasure.
Singularity.